Okay, cool. So yeah, shortly about myself. Yeah, I'm technical team lead at Comrade, located in Frankfurt, Germany. Last 2 years I was the Magento master. Yeah, and have some Adobe certificates as they name now, and they have, as you know, they have the same logo for all certifications. So that's why here is only one logo. But yeah, that's not that's not on our topics for today. Our topic for today is the consumers, and as we live in Magento world, that's a Magento consumers. And shortly, what is a consumer? The consumer is it's a messaging consumer that's an application. Basically, it's part of your software, or again, in our world, it's part of Magento that's consume messages from the queue. Yeah, in this message consumer world, so messages are landed in a queue produced by a publisher or by some execution of part of your software, then and this processing of the messages is don't need to know anything about what's happened then with the messages. So then consumer is taking them from the queue, and at the same time consumers doesn't care where this message come from, doing some action on this consumer on this message, and yeah, produce basically some output out of it. And yeah, shortly, which is I guess from Magento DevDocs, how it works on Magento message queue framework. So we have a publisher which has a message. It's going to exchange publishing into some queue, and then consumer is picking up messages from the queue itself. So from this old diagram, I guess I cannot cover all steps here today. We have only 30 minutes, unfortunately, because if to talk about this one really in details, we need a couple of hours. So the topic for today will be the consumers. So that's an part of Magento which consume the messages, which work with them, and yeah, doing some other actions after that. So consumers in Magento, they are available. They're there for you to execute operations which have to be executed in a synchronous manner. And the quite simple command to get the list of them, that's pin Magento Q consumers list. It will give you overview of all existed currently consumer on your system. And just a really short excursus into the history. That's how amount of consumers were different between the different versions. So initially they appeared in Magento Commerce 2.20, and they've been developed only for the Magento B2B, which work with a shared catalog. So there was only 2 consumers which have been there and available. Then on 2.3.0, the Magento Message Queue framework was migrated from open source to commerce. And directly after this happens, huge amount of new consumers start to popping up on the Magento, because again, if we talking about high performance scalable system, which Magento is, especially if you're talking about the big merchants, which has a big requirements list, a complex business logic there, then amount of operation and time, how long those operations takes, really requires some way to process them in a synchronous manner, so we are not just executing some action and not waiting for an answer. And for those purposes, we have those consumers available. And yeah, I mean, this amount is growing. In Magento 2.0, we have already like 22, if I'm not mistaken, maybe plus minus 1 available. So you can see that this used intensively. And honestly, have a look here, from this 22, I guess 8 is used by Magento inventory. So I guess that's most deep developed module related to the consumer's usage. So how to manage them and how to run them. So another command which start the consumer is queueConsumer start. Sounds quite simple, which accepts several parameters how you can influence on the consumer, which currently not optimal. Why and what can we do with it? I'll tell you a little bit later. So yeah, we have max amount of messages. So just for your understanding, the consumer is a process which is stuck into your memory and waiting for the messages usually. So with max messages, you defining how many messages it will accept till it kills itself. Then we have a batch size. So the batch size defines how many messages will be consumed like in one iteration. And this can be used only by batch consumers. Again, to this point, we'll come a little bit later. What is a batch consumer? Then we have area code. That's quite important. There's like different areas like global administration for GraphQL for different APIs. And you have possibility to run consumer like one of those areas. That's quite good to know because, for example, the asynchronous operations consumer will, in a lot of operations, require you to use the Web API REST as the area. And yeah, the default one for Magento, if you not specify it, will be a global one. And then single thread. So this option prevents to run multiple consumers at the same time. So it's used by the cron executor that will check if there is already such consumer run in a memory and will not create a new one for not overload your memory with multiple consumers. And yeah, quite a good point. You can also, I mean, if you will start the consumer with this command, which is default one, then your console, for example, so if you'll execute it from the console, will be blocked by this process. And nice stuff is to have an end in the end, that will run it into the processes. You will get process ID back, but you can proceed to do the further operations. I mean, if you're working in the terminal and let's say to run another consumer, or yeah, do whatever you want them. How they run? They run usually in Magento, as I told you before, you can run them manually or you can run them by cron job. So there is a consumer runner cron specially developed for the consumers, which check in the available consumers list, which can be run, then execute them. And the influence you can have here without like additional effort is basically the standard cron configuration, which you can find in Magento admin. There is for separate group named consumers. And yeah, you can basically define quite standard settings as can be defined for any other cron job in Magento. And how to configure them? So that's if you just have a cron job executed, it's not always the consumers will be run because the environment PHP has an own section for the cron consumers runner, which give you possibility to control what to run, when to run. So yeah, like give you some bit flexibility there. So cron run is defined true or false. So yeah, quite obvious. Max amount of messages, the same parameter I told you before. So that's how many messages will be processed till consumer will kill himself. Then we have the consumers list, which will be run or like will be executed. In this case, that's yeah, that can be multiple. And in the same way, you can block or define that, okay, I don't need to run this consumer particularly. Then please avoid it because there are a lot of consumers in Magento, and there can be cases when you don't really need some of them. So save your time because basically it will use the memory, it will use the resources of your system. And yeah, like some default values. So if you're talking about the Magento open source and we're talking about the open commerce edition, or yeah, right, commerce edition. So then it's by default, it's enabled, it's by default consume 10,000 messages and it will run all the consumers that are available in the system. But if you work with a cloud, and that's quite important that in this case, the consumers are disabled. And that was sometimes a surprise for me also that, yeah, I came to the system, or I can start to work, or our clients start to work with the cloud instances, and something that doesn't work for them correctly because the consumers are disabled there. And you can enable them by using the Magento Cloud configuration that, yeah, looks basically exactly the same as environment PHP you have configured before. And yeah, as one more option, this consumer wait for messages, that's one of the parameters which used for the run the consumer itself. It's also can be configured for the cloud by using the cloud environment variables. Yeah, let's shortly dive into the creation of your own consumers in Magento. Basically, for consumer have something to work with, there have to be messages. I'll not touch this topic today, so we will mostly talk about how to create a new consumers. So let's assume you already have the messages in the queue. There is also some topics for messages that have been already published into the queue, and you want to process them, or you want to extend existed ones, which is also possible, like not only using the default consumers, but you want to extend or add some additional functionality that already existed, like wrongly, to add the additional functionality to Magento, or like additional consumers that will process already existing queues and messages. Yeah, and to do this, you have quite simple. You have just XML configuration, which name queue consumer, and you can put the consumers there, which define the the name, the queue, which it will read messages from. Then you define in the connection is a database or IMQB. That's two currently defaultly available in Magento. Then you define in the consumer instance. That's instance which will work on the messages, so which will read messages from the queue, will execute them. And then you define the handler. So that basically the handler is a model and method which will process particular message and what then will happen with this message. Yeah, so the handlers. The Magento has out of box 3 different handlers available. That's queue consumer and sorry, wrongly. We can define those handlers in two possible locations. One of them is a queue consumer, and the second one is the communication XML files. And there's 3 consumers available out of box. That's Magento Framework message queue consumer, then batch consumer, and then also one consumer provided by Asynchronous Operations module, which named MageCONF. And in your queue consumers and communication XML, I'll jump shortly back. As you can see here, you can define the consumer instance. And here, in this example, is defined in the queue consumer XML file. But you also can define a communication XML, and that will influence on how the processes work and how basically which one will be read. That's quite good to know, because on some modules you may be confused why the consumer works not as expected. So always have a look also that if there's something defined in another file. So for example, the standard Magento Framework consumers, they will be executed, for example, in communication XML only if there's nothing in a queue consumer file. If there's something in a queue consumer file, then communication XML will be just ignored. And basically, why we need those 3 and what are they doing? So the Magento Framework message queue consumer is the default one, and if nothing is defined anywhere, which is still possible, you can just leave in all configuration files the consumer instance empty. Then the default will be used like a fallback. Then you have but it will read the messages from the queue one by one and then process them. If you don't want to read the messages one by one and you want to process them in batches, then you can guess that you can use batch consumer for that. In this case, it will read messages in a batches and will process them with one process. This use case is quite useful, I would say. Let's say if you are processing the pricing update and you have like a real small operations, which if you imagine you have 1 million of prices that you want to update, then it will read with the default consumer one by one, which will load the data, it will consume the memory. But if you process it with a batch consumers, it may be much faster to create just, let's say, one SQL query that will insert all the data with one SQL query, rather than each time you will execute SQL query for single one. So in this case, it will have to depend from your business logic and from the software you're developing. So take this as a note. And the third consumer, which is a little bit standing on the side, it's a Asynchronous Operation model MageCONF, and it was provided by Yeah, but asynchronous operation module for the Magento asynchronous and bulk API, and in this case, it will work with the messages which were published by those APIs. So how basically they execute on a background? So we have the consumers run in cron job, which I told you a little bit before. Then this cron job will check if they're already the consumers for this instance, and if not, then it will create a new ones. And then consumer terminates usually with the max amount of messages reached, or poison pill is executed. This functionality, yeah, basically, do you want to know more? Oh, yeah, the poison pill, that's a functionality which existed in Magento from 2.3, I guess. Yeah, which I will tell a little bit later about. And first, a little bit about weakness of consumers. Yeah, there are also weaknesses. So the first one is the process that's the consumer is a process in memory which takes your resources, but usually, or in current situation, executes only when the new messages are coming in. So this means if you have operations which take not so many time and which are not so oftenly used, then the process will stay in memory and will use this memory, even if it's not doing anything. And the second one, that's a possible dead processes, that's consumers which cannot be killed at all, and then you have to behave a little bit. So that's one of the such examples of one of the projects I had that, yeah, the server becomes slow. We didn't know why. We checked the process list, and then we saw that the huge amount of the same consumers run in the memory and stay there. And if you have a look, the only difference here is a release folder version. So yeah, you can imagine it's not using the Docker containers, but it's using the releases flow. Was developed by Deployer PHP for Magento and for PHP. So for with each release, a new folder were created, but the processes that were created for the folder, let's say 101, stay in the memory. And when the new one is created, then consumer runner cannot find already the processes in the memory for this path, and publishes the new ones. But the old ones still waiting for messages, and they will never get them. So it's led to the situation when a lot of messages are stuck. And yeah, so one of the possibilities which I told before is named poison pill. That's a functionality of Magento that's allow you to kill the consumer. It's basically one table in database which named Q poison pill with some random hash with a version, and when this version is updated, then consumer is checking this table, and if version is updated between what he has on his memory and what is in the database, then it kills himself. And this version is usually updated on 4 operations: is a config save, website save, store view save. Yeah, first of all, you can see there's no operation for like, oh, okay, I want to make a new redeployment and change the folder path. So it will stay the same first. Second one, even if you will update this version, the consumer will kill himself only when he will get a new message. This means, as again with the situation I told before, he will never get a new message. He will always stay in a memory. Yeah, and that's basically the Magento Framework message queue poison pill functionality. So you can still implement it yourself for your needs. I would say quite useful if you're working intensively with the asynchronous execution and especially with the consumers. Yeah, I love the community by the reason that if you need something, you can get, or you do it yourself, or you find the people who also need the same. So yeah, that was a pull request on Magento architectural channel for the proposal for some consumer improvements provided by Hostep. And yeah, it was groomed, it was checked, oh, it looks quite nice, let's do it. And then sometimes later, another already implementation was delivered in Magento 2. Yeah, and what basically it's doing, let's have a look. And it's telling ahead it was merged in 2.4.1, so you have it already available, because 2.4.1 is already available. And it's providing the new parameters for the consumer's execution, which make your life easier. First of all, it's a sleep parameter. It specifies time in seconds to sleep before checking if your new messages is available in a queue. So it's provided with some delays. Then makes idle time. that's define the time how long consumer will be available without any messages, and then he'd kill himself if there's still nothing coming. So it's solving the problem I told you before about. And then only spawn messages with message is basically only spawn when message available. That's the name of the parameter, which accept Boolean values. And what is it doing? It's initializing the consumer only if there is a message in a queue. And it works only with a cron consumer, so with consumers which are run by cron job. And before to create a new process, the cron job checks if there are messages available, and if yes, then it's created, and if not, then it's doing nothing. So it saves you really the memory and the time and effort. Yeah, and you can configure it in this way. So basically, the environment PHP file, when you define in your queue, you can configure it just right there. Also, you can define it on a consumer level. So this value I showed you, that's a global one. It will be available for all consumers at once. But you can also do it on a consumer level, where you can define, for each consumer its own settings. Also including the sleep, make, idle time, and those spam messages spawn when message available also. And that's only one tip. So you can, if you see that the consumers are provided by Magento Core, by third-party extension, not fit to your needs, and you want to change them the way how they behave, you don't need their own module. You can do it in your environment PHP. This on the left side, configuration, you can do it on consumer level here and change the settings which provided by XML. In this way, you can easily rewrite the existing consumers implementations without basically writing any code. Some best practices of usage. It's first of all, try to combine only spawn when message available with makes idle time. Because in this case, it will be initialized when the messages are there, and then when there are no other messages basically left, it will check for some time. Let's say it will stay 1 hour in a memory, and if nothing new came, then makes idle time will kill the consumer itself. So it will save your memory. And the second example, also the same option for only spawn when the message available, but consumer wait for messages. And with those configurations, you also will save quite a lot of memory used by the processes, because first of all, again, consumer will be initialized when the messages came to the system, and then will be killed when there are no other messages left. So that's those two options quite similar, but they depend a little bit on your business logic. So that's up to you to decide what's have to be used. Then let's have a look on the consumer in the Asynchronous Magento. First of all, there's one consumer which processing all the Asynchronous Magento methods. So async and bulk API, it's named async operations all. And the pros, basically, that's the single point which not required any knowledge about types of messages. So you can execute any Magento REST API call in a synchronous manner without basically knowing what is going on in the background. So it will be executed by this consumer. Also including all third-party implementations for the REST API. But it cons that the synchronous, it's basically synchronous of asynchronous operations, because each operation for the async and bulk execution will go to this consumer, and it will be in one queue. So it can be huge queue if you're using the, let's say, async API super intensively. And another one, the deadlocks are possible if you run the multiple consumers at the same time, because the same operations basically will be executed by the same consumer, and the same type of the operation will be executed by the same consumer, which may lead to the deadlock. It depends on the implementation. So number of the day, 251 different types of messages are managed by this one consumer, which quite a lot. It's defined here. So you can see that there is queue topology which defining the binding, so that all topics, which are basically our messages of asynchronous and bulk API, they all will go to the one this destination queue which name async operation all. What to do with it? We can split it. That's quite easily. It's doable by the only XML configurations. You don't need any additional code development here. So first of all, what is the topics names on this case? So for each operation, for each REST, put, post, delete requests, auto-generated the topic names, which named like a async like a prefix and come in lowercase of the service contract method, and for service contract name, then point method, then point HTTP method. So that's put, post, delete can be also page. And like example, so our topic name will look like this one. Why it's important? Because if I have a look here, we have the topics name. Here we stay with dot hash, which means that everything which has a topic name started with a synced point will go to one queue. You can already imagine how to split it. Is basically you can define in the you split in the messages by defining that, let's say, another topic with another name which you want to have. In this example, this product repository interface and category repository interface. Will go to their own queues which you will create. So that's, let's say, async operation products and async operation categories. And in this case, this default one, you can disable it by setting disabled equal to true. And then you create in two new consumers, which name async operation products and async operation categories, which has basically they are the same. So you just define in the name and then the queue which is written from, and then the instance and all other are stayed the same.
Oleksandr, I want to gently remind you that we have 5 minutes for the rest of the presentation and for the Q&A. So please take your time.
Got it. Okay, thank you. I guess I'm quite close already. Okay, so and if you will do it like I showed it before, you will see this one in your RabbitMQ interface. Then you can see here that we have async operations customers and products. Two new queues appeared, and they accepted each of them by 200 messages, and they will be worked by their own consumers. But you also see that async operation all, it has 400 here, which means it's also consumed those messages. This means your message will be executed twice, and we don't need this exactly. So please do not forget to delete this queue from your RabbitMQ. That's quite important to have, because even if you set a disable an XML configuration, it still will be here till we will not delete it. So that's how it has to look like. Okay, I executed here customers 2 times, so don't be surprised. But basically the goal here is that async operation all is not taking any messages anymore, and each own consumer taking their own messages. And the process of this, that each message time can be managed by own consumer, which is, I guess, great, because you can run multiple of them simultaneously for different types, and they will not interact with each other. It will be executed much faster because we don't have one general queue. So it will be faster, and you will have full control of the processes, what, where, and how executed. But it has also cons, because you need to create each consumer manually then for each of the operations. Because when you disable the global queue, all async bulk APIs stop working directly if you are not defining the queues for correct operation. Yeah, and if processes are too slow, we can add more consumers, and I make some tests here, and yeah, we're coming closer to the end. So what happens if you run the multiple consumer for the same operations? That's quite interesting. So let's, for example, have a look on a products import, and I have here 5,000 products which I imported with a bulk API. And on a first step, with one consumer running, it took about 260 something seconds. Then I decided to add the second consumer, and the execution was successfully of all 500, but it was almost double faster, so like 40% faster. Then I thought, why not to add 4, so like 2 more? Then I see that it's again even more faster. Okay, I can play like this long, so 8, again improving the speed, and if you will have a look on difference between 1 and 8, there is like 70% of improvement on the speed up of the processes. But then I added 8 more, and yeah, the process becomes slower. Despite you have more processes, the whole import becomes much slower because execution time, and you have too many processes at the same time in a memory running, which costs to using of the resources. So the writing to the same database, so you're still using the database traffic, the server traffic, mean that there are a limit. And yeah, if I can show you also 32, so that's again a little bit slower become here. And I thought maybe it's problem in products. Then shortly answer is no, not really. The customers import, let's say, has the same approach. So I will not tell you that the 8 is an optimal. This all depends from the objects you are using and from the server specs. But yeah, be aware there is a limit, and you have to decide it for yourself when you are working with it. So yeah, consumers in Magento are your friends. You can not just trust me, but also check it yourself. Thank you very much, and
awesome.
I'm done here.
Thank you, Oleksandr. We have a couple of questions here. So first one is like, does CPU covers quantity effects? I'm not sure that makes sense. What I just, but Stepan, if I'm
not sure.
Stepan,
yeah, okay. I also maybe not really got the question here, but I guess here is coming the topic about the multiple consumers on the memory, and each consumer in the memory take the CPU processes, and more you add in and more operations they executing, the more it will use. So you have to be careful on these steps. And as I showed one of those slides when I have overloaded with consumers, that the CPU was really full on 100%, and you cannot do anything with that. So you have to control your consumers.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have many questions here, so we'll try to answer them all. But the next one is, how do you create different consumers for a single type of operations? And I think that was covered during the presentation, but can you just restate that?
Yeah, basically you're just doing it with an XML configuration. You define a new queue, you create a new queue, and then you create a consumer for this queue. And if you're talking about, let's say, asynchronous operation, then you don't need to do anything else. If you're talking about something else, that will depend a little bit on your implementation, depend from which handler you are using for consumer. Or, if you're using your own handler, then honestly, I cannot answer here. You have to decide it yourself. But mostly everything is going on with the XML configuration, all with an environment PHP change.
Thank you. And the next question is the priority or kind of order for the queue supported? So for example, I have a synchronization of Magento and ERP system, and I synchronizing orders and products to Magento. So I first want to synchronize products and then orders in order to not have this is inconsistency. I have orders without existing products.
Yep, I got the question. Yep. Unfortunately, there are no default way to control it. And if you have a dependent object, you have to then the best way put them into the same queue. In this case, the sort order of the messages coming into the queue will be the same as the execution of those messages. So they will be not inconsistent. But if you have a different queues and different consumers, then you may have an issue that one of them will process messages faster than another one. Then unfortunately also depends from the business logic you have. You can use those controls of the consumers I told you before, like waiting for the messages, defining the delays if it will help you. That all will work. But you have to play around. It depends on your requirements.
So also, thank you. That the question is, actually that's pretty technical. So if you can help me and read the chat. So it's that's first question from Oleksandr Shimchishin, I think.
This long one, right? Have you faced the case when a couple of times per 100 messy Magento calls keeps running the topic calendar of stars and retakes the bit tables and the bulk tables were good, like Magento processors were successful and no exceptions? Honestly, not, but I can guess. I mean, have a look on your RabbitMQ configuration itself. If it was not, I mean, if it was configured correctly, do not stuck with some overload memory issues. Depends on the size of the messages also. So the size of the messages, it's MQP accepts also not unlimited, definitely. You have to have a look on those issues. And I can tell you there was an issue on 2.4.0 release related to the status update. It was fixed in 2.4.1, but it was only related to the database consumer, so for the DB implementation, and not for RabbitMQ. If you have any issues like that, you can find me in Slack by the name, and we can have a look on this one. And you can also create the issue on Magento repository and drop me a link. We can definitely try those use cases and we will try to fix it together.
Yeah, and also I think we still have 1 minute for Stepan's question, which is the last one. And Oleksandr, I know you have 2 more questions in pipeline, but I would encourage you to discuss them with Oleksandr after the presentation, probably in Slack or in chat rooms. So last question, Oleksandr.
From the Stepan about the integration test for the functionality. Yeah, you can basically do it. I guess this makes no sense that I will will drop you now like some code lines how to do it. There are already implementation in the Magento core. If you want, I can drop you later. Stepan, I know where you live. I can even send you a
Great.
post,
So Oleksandr, on that note, I just want to thank you for the amazing presentation today and for your time with us. I also want to thank you everybody for active participation in the chat and for your attention here today.